In this lesson, we're going to learn more about procedural and infinite terrains inside of View Extreme. So in the last lesson, we talked about standard terrains and their fixed resolution and how that can cause some unnecessary memory usage. And the solution that we had for that was to use procedural terrains. Now, procedural terrains adapt their level of detail dynamically to the camera. So basically what that means is whenever the camera is close to an area, it's going to be a higher resolution in that area and decrease the resolution in areas that the camera can't see, or it's just far away from the camera. So let's left click and create just a procedural terrain inside of our view just to kind of see how this works. So inside of my main camera view here, if I hit quick render, you'll see that our terrain has a very high level of detail. It's very hyper-realistic, and we really didn't have to add any resolution, and that's because procedural terrains do this dynamically. Now if I zoom out and I hit quick render, we still have a very high level of detail here. And if I keep zooming out, well, this is underneath the terrain. Let's actually go up above that. And if I continue to zoom out, it still looks really, really nice. And no matter how close we get, it's still going to look great. Now, obviously, because of this, the processing a procedural terrain is going to be more complex. But because of the advanced algorithm View 10 uses, they take place with minimum memory requirements and maximum efficiency. So unlike standard terrains, procedural terrains can be a little tricky and time-consuming to set up. Now, View ships with some presets for our procedural terrains here. So let's go ahead and delete this procedural terrain, and let's left-click on this procedural terrain object here, and you'll see that we have some presets that we can choose from. Now, the first thing that I want you to notice is that we have two different collections. We have infinite terrains, and then we have procedural terrains. So let's talk about these infinite terrains really quickly. So let's go ahead and choose one, and we're just going to go with this rough. Let's hit OK on this. Now it's going to ask me, you're creating an infinite procedural terrain. Would you like to discard the existing ground plane? Typically, infinite terrain should be used as a new ground plane, so we're going to go ahead and hit yes. Now, we're also going to have, for realistic atmosphere rendering, you should adjust the level of the sea in relation to the procedural terrain. Do you want to view the sea level? In this case, we'll go ahead and just hit yes, and it will add a hidden sea level at this point. So let's go ahead and rotate above our terrain here. And we'll pan up there. And let's do a quick render of this. Now you can see this terrain just goes on forever, and we can continue to dolly our camera forever, and we will never ever reach the end of this terrain. Okay? So with this, we can create some really epic backgrounds here. So if you are trying to create some sort of establishing shot for a video project or something like that, infinite terrains are going to be really helpful for you. Now, let's get back to those procedural terrains. So let's delete out our infinite terrain here, and let's right click and go back to our procedural terrains, and you'll see that we have several different presets that we can choose from in just the procedural terrains. So we can choose something like Strata 2 and get this sort of terrain. We can choose Strata 7. Go through all these different presets and you can really get an idea of what this detail is going to look like here. Alright, so let's choose something like Strata 11. Let's zoom out so we can see what this looks like exactly in our scene. And let's hit quick render. And you'll see that we get kind of like these plateau sort of things. So procedural terrains, they're going to be a little tricky to get this kind of effect. But because we have these presets, we can get a head start on the type of environment we're trying to create. Alright, so let's hit OK on this. And let's talk about some of the drawbacks to procedural terrains. Now, procedural terrains are going to be slower to render because of the computation of subpolygon detail. So as our camera gets closer and closer, it still has to compute those levels of detail. Okay. Now they're also very tricky to edit while still trying to maintain specific details. So as we come in and we start to edit the terrains with our terrain editor, we can lose some of that resolution and some of that detail in the terrain. Now this is mainly because the altitudes of a procedural terrain are defined using a mathematical function. So this can be very, very time consuming. So if you're an artist, this could be something a little harder to grasp because we need to create procedural terrains kind of in a mathematical sort of way. Now, for artists, there is kind of a touch-up process that we can use in our procedural terrains inside of the terrain editor. There are some simple guidelines that we need to follow, though, in order to receive a good result. But we'll go ahead and we'll dive into the terrain editor later on. So we've taken a look at infinite terrains and procedural terrains. And the main thing to take from these lessons is that procedural terrains are going to help us get a very high resolution bit of detail, and it really helps with taking out that fixed resolution problem. Now, like we said, the standard terrains are going to be very light on the render time because of that, whereas procedural terrains are going to take just a little bit longer, but you get a nicer result. Alright, so in our next lesson we're going to talk about our final terrain type, and that's going to be the spherical terrains. Okay, so we'll get into that in the next lesson.